It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. The story of Stefan Kiszko, who would be sent to Wakefield prison in 1976, is one which exemplifies how serious crimes can have such a far-reaching and detrimental impact. Not only the devastation it causes the loved ones, but the wider-reaching issues which this case exposed, from failings in the justice system to the brutality of prison life. Join me as I delve into the murder of Lesley Molseed and conviction of Stefan Kiszko. Born on August 14, 1964 in Manchester, Lesley Susan Anderson came into the world a fighter. Underweight and failing to thrive, she spent most of her first year in hospital. Diagnosed with a congenital defect, she would require open heart surgery to replace 2 valves when she was just 3 years old. A risky procedure for anyone, but given Lesley's tiny, underdeveloped body, it was one which the doctors had warned may not have a good outcome. Yet Lesley defied the odds, surviving the surgery. It was said to be a miracle, and her parents, Fred and April, were delighted that their youngest child had pulled through. By the time Lesley was 11 years old, her parents had separated. Her mother had married a man called Daniel Molseed, with Lesley taking her stepfather's surname. The couple lived with Lesley and her older siblings, Freddie, aged 12, and Laura, aged 13, on the Turfill estate in Rochdale, while Lesley's father, Fred, and 16-year-old sister Julie lived close by, with the estate being a place where the family thrived. Lesley's heart condition, which had affected her development to the extent that the 11-year-old had the build of a child 4 years her junior, standing only 4 foot tall, and weighing 3 stone. It had also resulted in her experiencing learning difficulties, for which she attended a specialist school. However, Lesley never let her fragile heart hold her back. Her mum, April, would give evidence at trial regarding Lesley's early years, recalling her fight to survive as an infant and how the family were protective of the youngster in the years after her major operation. But also they tried to give her a taste of independence and normalcy, recalling, quote, "We tried to treat Lesley as normal as possible. We did not want to treat her as an invalid. Doctors said try to let her find her own limitations, and that's what we did. But we did keep a real good eye on her." Describing Lesley's personality, April stated, "She had absolutely loads of friends. She was bubbly, full of life, full of joys of living. She was a little rogue at times, a little imp. She loved her home, she loved her family, she loved the dog. She was just enchanting, a little darling, and very generous." Lesley would demonstrate her cheeky yet helpful nature at 12:30 on Sunday the 5th of October 1975, when her mum April asked her to nip to the shops for some bread and an air freshener. As the children worked on a chore rota, it was technically her brother Freddie's turn to do the task, but with him attending football practice, the errand fell to Lesley instead, who cheekily told her mother she should also earn her brother's share of the money, as she was having to do his job. Laughing at her daughter's impishness, April watched as Lesley headed out the door, clutching a blue shopping bag with a Tweety Pie logo and the money clenched in her fist. The little 11-year-old headed off down the street, the hood of a dark blue raincoat concealing her bouncy brown curls, with her Bay City roller socks dancing as she skipped around the corner onto Stye-Ups Lane. April returned to preparing dinner, while Lesley's sister Laura was upstairs folding the laundry. Both were engrossed in their tasks, and the time slipped by, with Laura realising that it was 1 p.m, and Lesley had been gone for half an hour, when her trip should have only taken 15 minutes. Yet Lesley was prone to dilly-dallying, which witnesses later claimed they observed her doing that afternoon, and it wasn't uncommon for her to stop and chat to an acquaintance. Not overly concerned, April sent Laura and Freddie out to look for her, with the latter encountering their older sister, Julie, as he raced down the streets in search of Lesley. Concerns escalated when the family had approached all their neighbours, friends and relatives, with no one having seen Lesley. And when her stepfather Danny visited the shop which had been her destination, he was dismayed to learn that the shopkeeper had no recollection of the young girl being in the store that day. Having exhausted all possible explanations for Lesley's absence, the family contacted the police at 3 p.m. The response was swift, with officers combing the local area for any clues to determine what had happened to Lesley. With door-to-door inquiries and roadblocks in place, the community also came together to help in the search. Mark Hodgkinson, a reporter who grew up on the Tuft Hill estate, later wrote in The Guardian regarding how the children in the area helped, stating, quote, "They thought they stood a better chance of finding her than the grown-ups, because she was one of them. They knew the shortcuts, the hidey holes, the mill ponds and the abandoned cars, the tree swings, the secreted piles of wood ready for bonfire night. They imagined she'd be in the long grass somewhere, cradling a doll and sobbing." Yet as night fell on that Sunday night, nothing had been found to explain Lesley's disappearance, and her mother already had a gnawing feeling in her gut that something was wrong, with April stating on BBC Crime Watch in 2003 that, quote, "After 2 hours I knew she was gone. I could feel it in the whole of my body, and I never lost that feeling. It just grew stronger and stronger, and I thought, I'm never going to see her again." Over the next 2 days, April clung to the hope that the feeling of dread was wrong, but she had become convinced that someone had taken her daughter, and as dawn broke on Wednesday the 8th of October 1975, newspapers began to be distributed, with the Daily Mirror reporting on an interview given by April to a radio station the previous evening, in which she pleaded for her daughter's safe return. She voiced her concerns that Lesley had been kidnapped, and had made a direct appeal to the person who took her, pleading, quote, "If you have any compassion at all, or if you are a mother or father, or even someone in it for kicks, give her a chance." While the family approached that Wednesday morning, prepared for a third day of uncertainty, David Greenwell, a carpenter from Nottinghamshire, had awoken in his van, which he had parked in a lay-by on the A672, just a kilometre away from junction 22 of the M62 motorway. Having worked all day on a shop-fitting job in Rochdale, David had retreated, roughly 7 miles from the town centre, to the quiet rural lay-by, set amidst the bleak moorlands, where he would rest for the night. Accustomed to sleeping in his vehicle when working jobs away from home, David had everything he needed except for a toilet, which was provided by the windswept moorland surrounding him. On the morning of Wednesday the 8th of October, a sleepy David stumbled out of his van and ascended the steep overgrown embankment adjacent to the lay-by, in hopes of finding a secluded spot away from the road in order to relieve himself. With the vastness of the moor spread before him, his attention was drawn to a small ledge, where what appeared to be a bundle of clothes were lying. But upon closer inspection, he realised he was looking upon the deceased remains of a human being, positioned on their front, still clothed, but with their underwear exposed, and a blue bag with a Tweety Pie logo lying beside them. Within hours, the quiet moorland was bustling with police, including Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Dibb, who would head the investigation, and forensic experts who began to painstakingly check the area for evidence. Accompanying them was a contingent of reporters eager to stay up to date with developments, although the police were cautious not to link the discovery to the disappearance of Lesley, with DCS Dibb only willing to share that the body was fully clothed, and that, quote, "It is not yet known whether this child has any connection with the girl missing from Rochdale." He also declined to provide details on how the individual had died. Yet a subsequent post-mortem carried out by Dr. G, the head of the Forensic Science Laboratory at Leeds University, would conclude that the body, which was formally identified as Lesley, had sustained 12 stab wounds, which had been inflicted to the upper back and chest, with one blow piercing the heart, which doctors had once fought so hard to save. All these injuries, he surmised, had been incurred while the child had been lying in the position she was found, suggesting she was alive when she was brought to the moor. There was no signs that the child had been raped. However, her clothing had traces of semen, suggesting that someone had masturbated over them. Yet in 1975, with the advent of DNA profiling still decades away, there was little the police could do with this information, and as such they had to rely on traditional policing to catch the killer. Tapings of her clothing were taken in hopes that fibres would be found, which could link Lesley to her killer, and the testimonies of eyewitnesses were sought to help piece together what may have occurred. The day after the discovery, the police continued to try and keep certain details close to their chest, with Jack Dibb telling the press that they were still piecing together what had happened. However, he did state that, quote, "It is a senseless, brutal killing, and there does not appear to be any motive," with him suggesting that they could not rule out the possibility that Lesley knew her killer, going on to add, "One thing seems obvious, that shortly after 1 p.m. on Sunday, this girl was picked up in some sort of motor vehicle in the vicinity of Turf Hill Road or Delamere Road, and that between then and Monday morning she was murdered." This was preceded with the reiteration of a plea for anyone to come forward with information that could prove pertinent to the case. An early lead would come from a motorist who regularly travelled along the A672, and recalled that as he was passing the lay-by around breakfast time on the day before the body was found, he had seen a green saloon car parked up. He believed it was possibly a Humber Spectre or Hillman Hunter, and recalled it had a tartan blanket or travel rug covering the windows. While police chased down this lead, the focus remained on the Turf Hill estate in Rochdale, with Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Dibb issuing a stark warning to parents that, quote, "No child is safe in the area until this man is found." This statement came after reports that in the week leading up to Lesley's disappearance, a prowler had been seen in the area, who had allegedly been trying to lure young girls into his car. This prompted officers to be deployed to schools to speak to students regarding whether they had encountered this man, and a plea to parents to ask their children if they knew anything. Chief Superintendent Dibb informed the press, quote, "We hope soon to have a description of the man and the vehicle he uses," with the lead detective asserting that they believed that the person they were after lived in the area. A number of vehicles had been brought to their attention, including a fawn or yellow-coloured van that had been seen frequenting the estate in the weeks leading up to Lesley's death. Another vehicle, described as a bottle green Mark III Ford Cortina, had been seen parked in the lay-by on the A672 in the early hours of Tuesday morning, and at least one other occasion in the weeks before the murder. It was reported that it had blankets obscuring the interior view, and the windows were steamed up, suggesting it had been parked there for some time before the witness had seen it. The difficulty for police was that this lay-by was a popular spot for courting couples, as well as individuals like David Greenwell, who would stop there to sleep for the night. But each individual car and its occupants needed to be tracked down and eliminated from the inquiries. Concerns that the killer would strike again were amplified when it was revealed on Friday the 10th of October that police were looking into an attack carried out on a 6-year-old girl the day before Lesley's body was found. Chief Superintendent Dibb informed the press that at 4 p.m. on Tuesday the 7th of October, the 6-year-old girl had been playing near Manchester Road in Denton when a man lured her into his car with an offer of sweets. He then drove to an isolated road where he sat the girl on his lap, indecently assaulted her and exposed himself. On this occasion, the youngster was able to flee from the vehicle and ran home. Although this had occurred 12 miles away from Lesley's home, Chief Superintendent Dibb called it a significant incident and issued a description of the individual involved. He was said to be between 30 and 40 years of age, thin, with short brown hair. He was wearing a brown jacket and trousers, a red shirt, a green tie, and a plain gold ring on his left hand. The police also appealed for the driver of a 4-door Ford Cortina with a J or K registration, described to be bronze or grey in colour, in what was said to be a patchwork quilt effect, to contact them. It was alleged this vehicle had been in the area at the time of the attack, and police were eager to speak to the owner to determine if they had information relevant to the case. The press release came in conjunction with a newspaper article which suggested that, quote, Lesley was stabbed to death because she was the one little girl who did not run away in fear, with the report stating that other children had been approached by a man but had fled from him, before going on to refer to Chief Superintendent Dibb's refusal to rule out that the perpetrator was someone known to Lesley. Although the detective added that, quote, there is evidence Lesley was not afraid to talk to people. The other little girls may have been too afraid to talk to strangers. It was this final claim which would infuriate her family, who would argue that although Lesley was a trusting and polite young girl, she knew not to get into a stranger's car and insisted she would not have done so without a fight. Although one potential means by which the killer may have lured Lesley into his car would be suggested by police on Tuesday the 14th of October, with them theorising that the perpetrator had promised to help her find her lost kitten, Jinxie, which had disappeared from the family home 5 days before Lesley went missing. Going off this theory that the killer was local, they surmised that the individual may have seen the 11-year-old looking for the kitten as she made her way to the shop, and used that information as a means to lure her away. Yet this theory would bring them no closer to finding her killer, nor would the interviews that had been conducted in London with 2 individuals who had left the Rochdale area just after Lesley had disappeared. While the interviews were being conducted in the capital, the focus still remained on the area around the Turf Hill estate, with local children providing the police with many of the leads which were helping to propel the investigation forwards. A number of children had recalled seeing Lesley between 1 and 1:30 p.m. walking along Styups Lane, a gravel track which was bordered on both sides by high garden fences and ran parallel with Ansdell Road and Bursell Avenue. The latter road had a shop which was roughly 300 yards away from her home, and police had begun to consider whether Lesley had headed there first, only to find it closed, and therefore she made her way back to Styups Lane and headed towards another shop, which lay close to the corner of Ansdell Road and Buxton Crescent. Appeals for anyone who may have been in one of the 20 or so garages that lined the potential route down Styups Lane proved fruitless, leaving police unable to determine exactly where along her walk Lesley had been taken. One clue that did emerge was the sighting of a bronze or brown Mark III Ford Cortina seen driving on the estate at roughly 1:30 on the afternoon of Lesley's disappearance, with witnesses noting the vehicle had grey primer paint on one of the doors, which made it stand out. For investigators, this was a potential link with the attack on the 6-year-old girl in Denton, as a similar vehicle had been seen in that location also, although Chief Superintendent Dibb was keen to point out that they could not be certain they were the same vehicle. It was imperative the driver came forwards. His urgency to find the individual came alongside the revelation that evidence recovered from Lesley's clothing suggested that her murderer was, as described by Chief Superintendent Dibb, quote, a man who has sexual deviations, a mentally deranged man who is in urgent need of treatment. It begins to narrow down the field for the type of man we are looking for. He proceeded to state, now that people are aware of the sexual motive of this brutal killing, I hope that anybody who has been reluctant to come forward with information will do so now. If this does not shock them into reality, I don't know what will. Mr. Dibb also echoed his prior warnings that this individual would likely attack again, reasoning that, quote, a man with sexual deviations has uncontrollable urges which could flare up again. Irrespective of the great risk of him being caught, he could strike again. Yet as the investigation entered the third week, the police were no closer to identifying the perpetrator, but an eyewitness account provided to police around the 28th of October gave them a new lead. The witness had recalled seeing a hand-painted 1966 or 67 blue-green Morris or Austin van parked in the A672 lay-by between 2 p.m. and 10 past 4 on the Sunday Lesley had gone missing, with the witness also recalling that a blanket was concealing the windscreen and the driver's window. Chief Superintendent Dibb demonstrated his eagerness to trace this vehicle, claiming they were prepared to check every van in the northwest that matched that description, with him suggesting that the killer may have attempted to dispose of it, or alter the appearance of the van in the weeks since the murder. Speaking to the press, he emphasized the importance of finding the vehicle, and claimed, new evidence has come into our possession, which makes it important that we trace it as quickly as possible. What new evidence the police had was never revealed, and as Lesley was laid to rest at Rochdale Cemetery on the 7th of November, the hopes of catching her killer were beginning to fade. It wouldn't be until 2 days before Christmas that a new development would occur, with it being announced that an individual was being questioned at Halifax Police Station. He was formally identified on Christmas Eve as 24-year-old Stefan Ivan Kiszko. Born in Rochdale in 1952, Stefan's parents had arrived in England just after the Second World War, with his Ukrainian father, Ivan, and Yugoslavian mother, Charlotte, both taking up employment in a Rochdale cotton mill. Growing up, Stefan suffered from ill health, with him spending the majority of his time with his parents, and despite his large, imposing frame, his timid nature made him a target for bullies. Stefan had a close relationship with his parents, who provided him with a loving and stable home life. Yet in 1970, while Stefan and his father were walking home from a trip to the shops, Ivan collapsed and died from a heart attack, leaving his 18-year-old son devastated. With no friends to turn to, the loss of his father only strengthened his bond with his mother, Charlotte, whom he lived with in a house located less than a mile from Lesley's home. By the time he was 24, Stefan was a dutiful son and nephew, taking his mother and Auntie Elfreda on shopping trips, attending church on a Sunday, and going to work as a tax clerk. He abstained from drinking and rarely socialized, preferring to spend his time tending to his stamp collection. The 6'2" man who weighed 17 stone and walked with a waddling gait was a quiet and reclusive individual who was perceived by the community as a misfit, the type of man who may be hiding depraved desires behind his silent facade. His arrest was welcomed with relief by Lesley's family, the community, and the police, who were hopeful they had enough evidence to convict him of murder. Yet those connected to the case would have to wait 7 months to see him stand trial at Leeds Crown Court, with proceedings commencing on the 8th of July. Lesley's family were finally able to see the man who had taken Lesley's life, realising that the large, imposing figure who took to the dock would have towered over the 4-foot-tall 11-year-old girl, and would have easily overpowered her. Setting up their case against Stefan, Prosecutor Mr. Peter Taylor, QC, outlined the scenario they believed had occurred between the defendant and Lesley on the 5th of October 1975, stating, "You will hear that Kiszko suffered from abnormal physical development, which caused him to have no sex urges. He was treated for this by injections, and you will hear that he then developed a sex urge, but it was manifested in relation to young girls, to exposing himself and masturbating. Over a period of 3 days he indulged in such acts, and the abduction of Lesley was the climax." Mr. Taylor proceeded to tell the court that after Lesley had left to carry out the errand for her mother, the accused, quote, was in his car, saw her in the street and picked her up in his vehicle. He drove her onto the motorway to a lay-by. He took the girl onto the moor and ended up stabbing her 12 times with a knife and left her dead. The motive was clearly sexual, but there was no sexual interference with her or displacement of her clothes. It seems she was to the accused a sex object, whom he required to be there while he abused himself. That completed, he killed her and left the scene. The prosecutor continued by detailing how Stefan had come to the attention of police, stating that on October 3rd, 1976, Stefan had received testosterone injections, which they alleged caused him to develop sexual urges and increased aggression. Later that day, he exposed himself to a group of teenage girls leaving a Rochdale youth club, with 2 of the girls reporting that he repeated the act the following day. It was the statement of these witnesses which brought police to Stefan's door in December 1975. He was taken to the police station and questioned, initially denying any involvement in the murder, yet when his car was searched, the discovery of sex magazines suggested to police that Stefan had sexual proclivities. Meanwhile, the presence of balloons and 2 bags of sweets were theorized to have been used by Stefan to have lured young children to his vehicle. Under further scrutiny, Stefan confessed to exposing himself to the 2 girls from the youth club, with him claiming, quote, "The injections make me feel funny when I see girls." He would then proceed to admit to the murder of Lesley, once again blaming the testosterone injections. "Oh, this is terrible. It's those damned injections. I can't help myself." Before continuing to describe what he did to the 11-year-old, quote, "I talked to her in the car, then something came over me. I go all hazy and queer when I've had my injections. I got my knife out and I stuck it in her neck. I got back into my car and drove home." Although Stefan would later retract his confession, providing an alibi that he had been visiting his father's grave that Sunday afternoon. Despite this change, he was charged with the murder of Lesley Molseed, with the prosecutor adding that as the accused was being driven to Halifax to be charged, the police car stopped at the lay-by close to where Lesley's body was found, where it was alleged that Stefan began to shake, held up his hands and exclaimed, "I can hear noises, can't you?" As the trial entered the 3rd day, the prosecution called Principal Scientific Officer at the Home Office Lab in Harrogate, Mr. Outeridge, to take the stand. They asked him questions regarding forensic evidence recovered at the scene. Mr. Outeridge told the court he had examined articles and substances taken from over 30 vehicles to determine whether there was any connection to Lesley's murder. He confirmed that all but one was ruled out, going on to detail that when he compared carpet fibres recovered from Stefan's bronze-coloured Hillman Avenger with traces found on Lesley's jumper, vest, skirt and one of her socks, he found similarities, which led him to conclude that the 11-year-old had at some point been a passenger in Stefan's vehicle. Mr. Outeridge went on to describe how he examined a number of knives given to him by the police and determined that a pocket knife tested positive for blood, although he conceded it was inconclusive regarding the blood type or whether it actually belonged to a human or an animal. The expert witness would also detail how he attended the scene where Lesley's body was found, and stated that from her clothing and her positioning, he concluded that the assault had occurred on the moorland. This conclusion was corroborated by the prosecution's next witness, Home Office pathologist Professor David G., who, having attended the scene and carried out the subsequent post-mortem, was able to confirm that the majority of the 12 stab wounds had been inflicted while Lesley was lying in the face-down position in which she was discovered. The professor elaborated on her injuries by stating that 9 of them entered the back, while the others were focused around the chest, with one cutting the main artery of the heart, while another pierced the heart itself. This last detail must have been incredibly hard for Lesley's loved ones to hear, given the little girl's struggles to live with a heart defect. In closing his testimony, Professor G advised the court that following his examination, he could find no evidence of sexual interference. Having heard from forensic experts, the prosecution called upon witnesses who would testify regarding Stefan's actions around the time of the murder, including Mrs. Sheila Buckley, whose daughter Maxine had been one of the girls from the youth club. Mrs. Buckley told the court that on October 4, 1975, her 13-year-old daughter came home hysterical with claims that a man had exposed himself to her. Determined to hunt down this individual, the mother and daughter, accompanied by the neighbour's son, headed to the man's home, and upon Maxine positively identifying him, Mrs. Buckley contacted the police. Following her mother's testimony, the teenage Maxine took to the stand, and when asked if the individual was in the courtroom, she pointed at Stefan. Upon the commencement of the trial, more information would come to light regarding Maxine's experience, with her mother, Mrs. Buckley, telling the Manchester Evening News that the 13-year-old had endured a campaign of terror over several weeks, during which the teenager had been stalked by Stefan. Mrs. Buckley stated that, quote, "My daughter had a nightmare life until the monster was arrested. He frightened several local girls in a campaign of terror. Once he drove slowly past our house on 14 consecutive days, and I was convinced he was out to get Maxine." She also related the events of November 5, 1975, when she claimed he had been lurking in the darkness, waiting until Maxine came near, and then jumped out on her. This was the incident that prompted the mother to track the culprit down, explaining to the newspaper that, "I wanted Maxine to be sure it was the same person who had followed her and exposed himself. She said it was, and we got on to the police again." With her daughter confirming that Stefan was the man who had been terrorising her, Mrs. Buckley reported him to the police, which would ultimately lead to him being arrested for Lesley's murder. However, Mrs. Buckley voiced her discontent with how her prior complaints had been handled. "I was very annoyed at the police. At first it appeared they did not want to know. I made dozens of phone calls and Maxine was interviewed several times. We told them where Stefan Kiszko lived. They didn't seem to take our complaints seriously. I feel they could have arrested him sooner." Chief Superintendent Jack Dabe, who had been overseeing the murder investigation, issued a statement refuting the accusation that the issue was not taken seriously, with him stating, "Mrs. Buckley has never complained to us. We followed up her information straight away. Initially, several people were suspect. You cannot just arrest someone until you have enough evidence. In an inquiry of this kind, we investigate fully all the information submitted by the public as soon as possible." While the investigation would come under scrutiny in later years, in July 1975, the trial continued into its second week, with Mr. David Waddington presenting the case for the defence, in which they reiterated the alibi which the defendant had provided police after he had retracted his confession. Stefan had claimed that on the day of the murder, he, accompanied by his mother and aunt, had gone to Rochdale Cemetery to visit his father's grave. They then stopped at a shop, drove his aunt home, after which he and his mother headed to their house. Having laid out his client's alibi, Mr. Waddington proceeded to paint a picture of 24-year-old Stefan as a, quote, a rather strange man who was emotionally immature and dependent on his mother, with whom he still resided. The following day, Stefan took to the witness box, with him being permitted to sit during his testimony. The 24-year-old was asked to recall his movements on the day of Lesley's murder, to which he stated, "It was the usual sort of Sunday morning for me. I had my dinner at home about 12 o'clock. In the afternoon I would take my mother and my aunt to the cemetery. We came back to our house, plus the fact that we stopped at a continental grocer's. I would normally leave at 1:45, so as to get back home before people leave public houses, because I dislike being on the roads when people are driving who have been drinking." This statement would be bolstered when his mother Charlotte was called to the stand, with her asserting that Stefan was always with her at the weekends. However, there were other aspects of Stefan's testimony which would prove problematic. Firstly, he was asked why he had retracted his confession, with him claiming that he had confessed while feeling under duress, and that during the police interviews he had felt, quote, "sick, upset and absolutely terrified. I wanted them to stop questioning me, but they just went on and on and on." Yet it was during cross-examination that his confession would be used by the prosecution to cast doubt on Stefan's character, with Peter Taylor QC reading an excerpt from the document in which Stefan stated, "When I had this treatment, it made me go dizzy for 3 or 4 days, and then I felt a lot better, and it helps me in my sex life." When asked to explain this, Stefan tried to claim that he meant that the injections which he had received after being diagnosed with underdeveloped sex organs had not, as the prosecution claimed, stimulated his sexual urges, admitting it had, however, allowed him to masturbate occasionally. But he asserted, "I wasn't leading any kind of Casanova sex life," insisting that he still had no sex life, and that the only real difference he had noticed since receiving the testosterone injections was that he had begun to grow facial hair, which he was now able to shave, and this had made him feel more like a man. He also denied that the treatment had awakened his attraction towards minors, an assertion supported by the defence expert Dr. Barry Enoch, a consultant physician who stated that although the testosterone may increase aggression, it would not cause an individual to develop an attraction towards children. Following on from the testimony of Dr. Enoch, the defence team called upon the expertise of consultant psychiatrist Dr. Michael Tosh, who advised the court that Lesley may have inadvertently caused her own death. Elaborating on this, the doctor stated that, quote, "Some sort of rejection or fighting words on behalf of the little girl would have been the trigger to prompt this frenzied outburst, which clearly there was." He suggested it was possible such a trigger may have come from the 11-year-old girl, calling her attacker a dirty old man, or suggesting that he should be locked up. Dr. Tosh stated that these words may have caused her attacker to, quote, "become uncontrollably angry." With regards to Stefan's character, Dr. Tosh referred to the close relationship that the defendant had with his mother and aunt, who appeared to be his sole companions. Stefan was seen to be a loner. Although he did maintain a steady job working as a tax clerk, he rarely socialised, and according to Dr. Tosh, Stefan, quote, "led a rather drab sort of life." In terms of intellect, the doctor estimated Stefan to have a, quote, "grammar school intellect," but had an abnormal yet vulnerable personality and was sexually immature. Dr. Tosh continued by suggesting that upon having the testosterone injections, Stefan became, quote, "physically and sexually a new man," and had become so over the preceding 6 weeks or so. When asked by the defence counsel, David Waddington QC, whether Stefan, quote, "could have been emotionally prepared for the sudden appearance of sex drives," Dr. Tosh replied, "No, I see him emotionally like an 11 or 12-year-old. As the two sides presented their closing arguments, the prosecution remained steadfast in their assertion regarding what had happened. Yet the defence, whose initial presentation was from the angle that Stefan had no involvement in Lesley's death, put forward an alternate scenario in which Stefan had killed Lesley, but they argued that should the jury find this to be the case, they should consider the charge of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, with the defence insinuating that Stefan had suffered some mental impairment due to the testosterone injections. By July the 23rd, 1976, the trial came to its conclusion, with the jury taking 5.5 hours to reach a 10-2 majority verdict of guilty. Having sentenced Stefan Kiszko to life in prison, Judge Mr. Justice Parks paid tributes to the efforts of those who had aided in securing the conviction, making a special mention to 13-year-old Maxine Buckley, whose bravery and keen eyes had put police on the trail of the killer. Now a convicted child killer, Stefan was transferred from Armley Prison in Leeds to Wakefield, where he would experience the life of individuals considered to be the scum of the earth by other inmates. Just a day after his arrival in Wakefield, Stefan was introduced to the brutality dished out to child killers and sex offenders, with him being accosted by 5 prisoners. They inflicted wounds to his mouth, knee and ankle, while also damaging Stefan's radio and watch, with the inmates citing it was in retaliation for what he did to Lesley. For his own protection, Stefan was placed in segregation, away from the general prison population. But he would be attacked again on the 11th of May 1977, when he was assaulted with a mop handle, resulting in a head injury which required 17 stitches. Amidst the physical and verbal abuse Stefan would endure over the ensuing years, he refused to admit his guilt. Within weeks of his incarceration, he wrote to a family friend, "I am in prison for a crime I have not committed. I am missing my mother very much. I hope there will be a happy ending." Yet his resolve and hopefulness would be tested, pushing his mental and physical health to their breaking point. Within 2 years of his imprisonment, Stefan's first appeal was rejected, with Lord Justice Bridge stating in May 1978, "We can find no grounds whatsoever to condemn the jury's verdict of murder as in any way unsafe or unsatisfactory. The appeal is dismissed." And so Stefan's sentence continued, as did the abuse. Just 7 months after his failed appeal, he was assaulted in the prison chapel. For his safety, he was kept in isolation from other prisoners, but this did not stop the endless verbal abuse and disdainful looks. By the end of the 1970s, Stefan's fragile mental state would be tested, particularly after receiving a letter in July 1979 from the Inland Revenue, formally dismissing him from his role as a tax clerk. Apart from the presence of his mother and aunt, his job had been the only other consistent part of his life. Perhaps it was the loss of his job, combined with the harsh conditions of prison, that caused a decline in his mental state. He began to speculate that he had been falsely imprisoned, as part of an experiment to determine the effects of prison life on an individual, and he claimed he could hear coded messages on the radio. These delusions were early signs that he was developing schizophrenia, although a forensic psychiatrist would also suggest that Stefan's claim he was wrongly convicted were delusions of innocence. The once passive Stefan would also begin to show signs of aggression when provoked. Whereas before he would have taken a beating without retaliation, in March 1981 he fought back against his attacker. As his personality shifted, so did his delusions, with Stefan beginning to make more outlandish claims, including the assertion that his parents had been recording him singing songs he had written, and they had then sold the tapes to Barry Manilow. By 1984, Stefan had been in prison for 8 years, most of it spent in isolation for his own protection. He was a man accustomed to routine, and although day-to-day prison life offered this, he would also be unsettled by the frequent moves to various prisons throughout the country, with him residing in at least 4 different facilities over the 8 years. One thing, however, remained constant: the love and devotion shown to him by his mother and aunt, both of whom spent hundreds of pounds and travelled great distances in order to visit him wherever he had been placed. They were the only friendly faces he saw, and were the only ones who believed in his innocence. Yet they had no resources to support their assertions, and it seemed that Stefan's only hope for freedom was to admit his guilt, which he was advised would potentially make him eligible for parole. But Stefan refused to go down that path. It was also in 1984 that concerns were raised regarding Stefan's mental state, with a psychiatrist putting forth the recommendation that a secure psychiatric facility would be better suited to his needs. Yet this suggestion went unheeded. Seeing the detrimental impact prison was having on her son, and certain of his innocence, Charlotte Kiszko was determined to prove that he was not a killer. Since the start of his incarceration, she had tirelessly tried to fight for him, sending letters to the Prime Minister, writing to the Queen, and anyone else who may be able to help her son. But the widow, who had come to England as a refugee during the Second World War, would face an uphill battle. Unable to support her campaign financially, and with few people who shared her belief in Stefan's innocence, she was driven forward by her devotion to her child. Meanwhile, Stefan continued to linger within the prison system, ending up in Grendon Prison in Buckinghamshire in August 1987, where the prison governor, Dr. David Wilson, would try to encourage Stefan to participate in a treatment programme for sex offenders. The course required those enrolled to acknowledge their crimes and contemplate the reasons behind their actions. But Stefan declined to participate in the programme, resulting in it being determined that he was, quote, refusing to address his offending behaviour. With her son continuing to declare his innocence, Charlotte continued her campaign, which received a boost when she was awarded £6,000 in compensation for a work-related illness. She now had the financial means to seek legal assistance, and with the help of lawyer Campbell Malone and a private detective called Peter Jackson, the campaign to prove Stefan's innocence gained momentum. The first positive step came while Stefan was in Wakefield prison in February 1990, where he was informed that he would be eligible for his first parole hearing in December 1992. Yet his release would be dependent on a number of factors. He would have to acknowledge his crime and the motive behind it, and demonstrate that he no longer posed a threat to children. As enticing as the prospect of freedom may have been, Stefan did not want to be freed by confessing to a crime he insisted he did not commit. And there were signs that others were taking his claims seriously, including Mr. Waddington, who had aided in Stefan's defence in his 1976 trial. But in 1990, Mr. Waddington was the Home Secretary. In his new role, Mr. Waddington reviewed the case and instructed that it should be reinvestigated, prompting a review by West Yorkshire Police, who in turn submitted a file to Mr. Waddington's successor, Kenneth Baker, in May 1991, stating that there was potential new evidence. The Court of Appeal would be presented with a case which systematically unravelled many aspects of the original investigation and trial, although there was one major disadvantage. Most of the original evidence had been destroyed in 1985. Yet this would not deter Campbell Malone from fighting to prove Stefan's innocence, with the solicitor advising the press that the appeal would be formed around the unreliable nature of the confession and allegations that evidence available at the time of the 1976 trial, which could have been favourable for Stefan, had not been presented. Key arguments regarding the veracity of the conviction began with the testimony of the teenage girls, including Maxine Buckley, whose allegations had led police to Stefan's door, resulting in him being brought into the station to answer questions regarding the indecent exposure complaints. When these allegations were reinvestigated, it was discovered that aside from the teenagers' testimonies, there was no other evidence to definitively prove that Stefan was the man they had seen. It would also emerge that the man witnessed outside the youth club on the Friday night, which the girls had claimed was Stefan, had actually been a milkman who had stopped to relieve himself behind a tree. It would also emerge in the 1990s that the girls had fabricated their stories regarding the incidents they testified to in court. It was these testimonies which had made Stefan a person of interest, and without them there was nothing to suggest Stefan had committed any offence, which would have weakened the prosecution's case that he was a sexual deviant. The teenage girls' false accusations formed part of the puzzle, which enabled an innocent man to go to jail. But they, like others involved in the case, would not be held accountable for their actions. Even without their testimony, the prosecution in the original trial still had a strong case, as they were able to use Stefan's own words against him. Yet it was noted in the 1991 appeal that the confession may not have been acquired properly. Firstly, it was done without any legal counsel present, which was standard practice in 1975, but it's worth noting that once a solicitor was appointed, the statement was retracted. Aside from this, the confession had not been written by Stefan himself, who stated that an officer had brought it, and he simply signed the document. Stefan also repeated the allegations he had made during the trial that his confession was made under duress, alleging that he felt threatened by the officers, who persisted on bombarding him with questions over many hours, while also assuring him that once he had disclosed what had occurred, he would be allowed to go home. While the authenticity of the confession was called into question, the review into the original inquiry also found that numerous potential leads remained unresolved, in particular, the failure to trace a number of vehicles. The first was a white car, seen on Wellyther Lane, half a mile from Lesley's last known location. A witness advised police that a young girl, matching the 11-year-old's description, was sat in the passenger seat. Another vehicle which had come to the interest of the police was a bronze Ford Cortina, which had been seen in the Denton area of Manchester around the time 2 sexual offences were committed against children. More crucially was the sighting of a blue van which had been parked in the moorland lay-by on the afternoon of Lesley's disappearance, which, like the other 2 vehicles, the police failed to locate. The key thing about these vehicles was that none of them were similar in colour or description to the Hillman Avenger owned by Stefan Kiszko. It was also argued that fibres recovered from Stefan's vehicle, which was said to be a match to those on Lesley's clothing, came from a type of carpet of which quite considerable quantities were manufactured, and as such it was highly probable the fibres had come from another source other than Stefan's car. As for the evidence which could place Stefan at the scene of the murder, the police discovered a red biro located close to where Lesley was found, and tenuously linked it to Stefan. The police had discovered a book in Stefan's car, in which he had indulged his hobby of logging down number plates, either in black or blue ink, although one had been written in red. During the search of his vehicle, only the black and blue pen were found, with investigators deducing that the red one was missing because Stefan had inadvertently dropped it while attacking Lesley. Delving deeper into the registration plates which had been logged in red, the vehicle was tracked down, and the owner informed the police that they had driven past the lay-by on the day of the murder. This led to speculation that Stefan had written the licence plate in red, perhaps to record it as a potential witness to his crime, and he had accidentally dropped the pen afterwards. During the investigation carried out by Campbell Malone and his team, it was determined that the particular number plate belonged to an individual who had been in a disagreement with Stefan over a parking issue a couple of weeks earlier, and it was this incident that had prompted the entry. It was just pure coincidence that the same car drove past the crime scene on the day of the murder. Campbell Malone also tasked his team with chasing down Stefan's alibi on the 5th of October 1975, with him claiming that he had spent it with his aunt Alfreda and his mother Charlotte, a claim the pair corroborated. Charlotte had told police she was certain that he was with her that Sunday, because it was the same day emergency vehicles attended an incident near her home. Yet when this was checked, it was found that her recollection was a week off, naturally casting doubt on Stefan's alibi. Campbell Malone was able to track down other witnesses who claimed they had seen Stefan that afternoon, including 2 individuals who saw him in a shop. At the time, it was believed Lesley was taken. This testimony was not heard at the 1976 trial, with one of the witnesses advising Mr. Malone that they told police they were going on holiday during the dates the trial was set, and were informed that it wasn't an issue, as their testimony wouldn't be required. While the defence during the 1976 trial initially put a great deal of emphasis on Stefan being with his mother and aunt on the day of the murder, his counsel, Mr. Waddington, would change tact during proceedings, opting to argue a case of diminished responsibility on account of the effects of the testosterone treatments. Not only did this change in direction negate Stefan's alibi and contradict his client's claims that he had no involvement in the murder, but Mr. Waddington opted for this strategy without consulting Stefan, and in defiance of expert opinion that the injections would not have affected Stefan in such a manner that would cause him to attack a child. It was argued that these decisions by the defence undermined Stefan's case and cast doubt on his credibility. During the trial, Stefan's medical history formed a key part of the case, yet one aspect was not disclosed: the fact that at the time of the murder, Stefan was recovering from a serious ankle injury, which had meant that he had been unable to drive for several weeks, and it was still causing him issues around the 5th of October 1975. Campbell Malone would suggest that the mobility issues caused by the ankle injury would have made it virtually impossible for Stefan to have ascended the steep slope from the lay-by to the spot where Lesley's body was found. While this piece of medical history was overlooked, another was presented, but it was missing a vital piece of information. The prosecution made a point of drawing a connection between the testosterone injections and how they had awakened Stefan's sexual urges. However, little was made of the condition which the injections were treating, with it being revealed at the appeal that Stefan suffered from hypergonadism, which essentially meant that he had low testosterone levels due to his testes not functioning properly. The NHS lists the symptoms of this condition as fatigue, lethargy, depression, anxiety, irritability, decreased shaving frequency, reduced exercise tolerance and strength, excessive sweating and night sweats, poor concentration and/or memory, reduced sex drive, and erectile dysfunction. The testosterone injections were designed to help increase the levels in the body and alleviate some of the symptoms. Yet there are also side effects with the treatment, including prolonged painful erections and increased aggression. The first one may explain why, when answering questions regarding the indecent exposure, Stefan had blamed the injections and stated he couldn't help it, suggesting that the erection was unexpected and perhaps an embarrassing incident. It would, however, be the case for the prosecution that the testosterone-induced sexual urges and the increased aggression had led to Stefan committing murder. What was not mentioned was the detail that hypergonadism can cause infertility, and that tissues recovered from Stefan's bedroom, along with a sample acquired by police surgeon Dr. Tierney during the original investigation, had been tested and showed that Stefan was infertile. Yet the semen recovered from Lesley's clothing did not indicate this, suggesting the secretor was not Stefan. This information, if handled properly, would have cast doubt on Stefan's guilt. Yet this vital piece of evidence was not brought up at trial, as its existence was unknown to both the prosecution and the defence. And when Dr. Tiernan, who had noted the discrepancy, was called to give evidence, he was not granted the opportunity to disclose his findings regarding this matter. Almost 16 years since his conviction, the scales of justice appeared to be leaning in Stefan's favour. However, concerns persisted regarding his mental well-being, particularly after he was witnessed appearing to fight an invisible opponent in his cell. When asked to explain his behaviour, Stefan claimed he was defending himself from a ghost which was sexually assaulting him. This latest incident would result in Stefan being diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he was placed in Ashworth Psychiatric Hospital. However, in December 1991, the decision was made that he should be granted bail while his case was being considered by the Court of Appeal. Considered to be too mentally unwell to be released from Ashworth, as he still demonstrated signs of his disorder, including verbal aggression, he was not believed to pose any physical danger to others, which meant Stefan was no longer required to stay in a secure facility. This would be reflected in his bail conditions, which stipulated he remain in a psychiatric hospital near Manchester, from where he would be discharged should his mental state improve. On Tuesday the 18th of February 1992, 16 years after his incarceration, 40-year-old Stefan Kiszko would be exonerated by the Court of Appeal on the grounds that his conviction was unsafe and unsatisfactory, with the three presiding judges referring to the sperm found on Lesley's clothes as being unlikely to have belonged to Stefan, with them deducing that, quote, "The result that this man cannot have been the person responsible for the ejaculation, and consequently cannot have been the murderer." Officially declared an innocent man, Stefan prepared for a new life of freedom, but first he had to address the reporters, all eager to get his story. The 40-year-old described his years of torment in prison, being the victim of assaults and verbal abuse, all because the other inmates believed he was a child killer. He also praised his mother and aunt, whose steadfast determination to prove his innocence had helped him regain his freedom, but he also expressed sadness for Lesley's family, who had suffered the loss of a child, and thought the culprit had been brought to justice, only for their wounds to be ripped open 16 years later, with them facing new uncertainties and heartbreak. While Stefan expressed his sympathies for Lesley's loved ones, and his hopes that the true perpetrator be apprehended, he also spoke of his own dreams for the future, stating his desire to go on holiday and one day be married. And over the next few months he would receive news that he was due to be awarded £500,000 in compensation. Yet in a cruel twist, Stefan would have less than 2 years of freedom, as on the 23rd of December 1993, 18 years from the day he was arrested, Stefan Kiszko died of a heart attack. Still awaiting his compensation, he never went on his longed-for holiday, and had spent his final couple of years as a virtual recluse, unable to adjust to life outside the prison walls. One thing he was able to see before he died was his mother being rewarded for her tireless campaigning, with Charlotte Kiszko being named the first recipient of the Rochdale Woman of the Year Award in 1993. Following the death of her beloved son, Charlotte's health declined quickly, and on the 7th of May 1994 she followed him to the grave. However, in a final act of devotion, she had stipulated in her will that the compensation money, which was still pending, should be used to benefit charity, as well as a memorial fund in her son's name, so he will never be forgotten. The murder of Lesley Molseed brought heartbreak for two families, but with the exoneration of Stefan Kiszko, her loved ones would once again be seeking answers. If Stefan was innocent, who had taken Lesley from them? Join me next time as I delve into the reopening of the investigation, potential suspects, and the discovery of the actual perpetrator.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on chumbacasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at chumbacasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's chumbacasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.